From 30 years in practice, I learned probably the hard way. I was always a little bit slow on the uptake, but to cut open a pig and diagnose respiratory disease was easy. But to detail what was in that lung and in those lung lesions wasn't as easy. And very seldom in practice. I mean, when we were in school, the professors like Dr. Madsen would show us lesions and say, they'd show us pictures of pure cultured or pure challenged lungs and say, this is what this looks like. But very seldom did I ever get one back where it was exactly like the book. And very seldom were they all by themselves, that we'd get a pure infection of PRRS or mycoplasma or bacterial secondaries. And so whether it's clinical signs or gross lesions, it's difficult to diagnose. That's why we send stuff into the diagnostic lab at Iowa State and the other good diagnostic labs. So it's very similar lesions, very similar symptoms like cough. It's a general symptom, but you can't always tell what's going on in there. Certainly we know that all these respiratory problems will decrease performance. Different degrees with different bugs, how well they're controlled, how well they're treated, how early the intervention is. And certainly we'll see sometimes certain of these respiratory pathogens can increase mortality in culls and tail enders too. And so whenever the costs go up, performance goes down, the profits shrink as well. So I'm bringing you a little paper that was presented this spring in Denver at the AASV in the student section of all places. And there was a student there by the name of Kara Hayden from Iowa State, and she worked on this project with Dr. Fangman from our group. And she had a chance to get into a very large production system and get back to be able to look at closeouts on almost 400 sites or 400 barns over from about 2007 to 2011. And she took those closeouts and how well they did on performance, and she compared them to diagnostic reports that came back on those individual barns. So she'd be able to say, okay, this barn closed out with this many culls and mortalities and tail enders, and it also had this performance on average daily gain. So what did I find was diagnosed in that closeout? And so she categorized these. These pigs, we didn't use, she didn't use any comparison with PCV2 because this entire population, entire flow had been vaccinated. And she compared these closeouts to what they considered a baseline performance, okay? And the baseline were closeouts that they had over the years from myco, PRRS, and SIV negative flows. And so they were able to say, this is what happens when there's no respiratory disease. And so then she categorized these as either a diagnosis of MHIO or PRRS alone or SIV alone, and then she started looking at the different combinations. And you might notice that on the bottom there probably were some, and there absolutely were some, with all three of these pathogens diagnosed. But there were so few of those in the end, they had a lab diagnosis of all three, that she didn't include that in her analysis. But I will tell you, the trend, even though there weren't enough to get a statistical difference, the trend would have been that it would have been worse with all three. So if you don't take home anything else today from my portion, is that all of these respiratory pathogens will cause problems and decrease performance and hurt you on profit. But in combination of any two or more of them, it's worse. It's on steroids. And so it's not just additive. You can see here that on the difference between the baseline, and MCT stands for mortality, culls, and tail enders. You can see what happens when MHIO is there alone versus the negative and naive baseline, that the mortality culls and tail enders went up about 2%. And the average daily gain on this one, a little bit of an outlier, not statistically significant, but actually the average daily gain was better. Now, I will tell you that on mycoplasma, these pigs were all vaccinated, every one of these closeouts. Go on down to PRRS, the mortality calls and tail enders by itself, 1.68. And this is real world numbers now out of actual closeouts. No, they hadn't gone in and challenged these pigs or done anything from a control standpoint. SIV, 1.87. Then you go to the next line, and you have PRRS and MHIO together, and you can see that it jumps up to 5.34% on mortality calls and tail enders, and it dropped the average daily gain by 0.14. And both of those were statistically significant changes from the single pathogen disease. PRRS and SIV, same way, jumped up 4.34, more than doubled the mortality calls and tail enders, and then average daily gain actually was worse, so 0.16 pounds per day worse. And then SIV and MHIO together, 3.46% mortality calls and tail enders, and then a negative 0.18 on average daily gain. So what's that mean in dollars and cents? Well, thanks to Kara, she did the calculations using that baseline again, and using a tool that was also developed by someone at Iowa State, Dr. Darrell Holtkamp, with his return on equity or return on investment calculator. She was able to take their numbers with current prices and plug these in and say, what did this really cost us per pig? And again, you can see that PRRS or MHIO, PRRS, and SIV alone, they do damage, but nothing like when they're combined with any of the other two. And if you just do the math on that and carry it over to a loss per 2,400 head barn or site, you can see that the losses become substantial in a hurry. And then I'll just reiterate that in combination, those few closeouts where all three were lab diagnosed, the losses were even higher than this. And another thing to point out on this is that it's not additive. So if you add MHIO loss per pig to the SIV loss per pig, you can see it would have come out to around $3.80, 90. But if you look at that same line following the SIV, the MHIO and SIV together, it almost tripled. And so they're not additive, they are multiplicable. So PRRS virus alone, we just had a nice study come out of Iowa State and Dr. Holtkamp's study that he worked with National Pork Board last year, at the end of last year. And again, found the PRRS virus alone estimated cost of the U.S. swine industry $664 million annually, and $302 million in the breeding herd and $362 million in the growing pig herd. And so our losses due to PRRS, this was from the last study that was done prior to this, also showed the same thing, that the majority of the losses is not in the sow farm where it gets a lot of attention, but in the growing pig model. And I think the numbers that Kara Hayden got out of her study would also reflect this. So we've, over the years, BI has come up with a really simple plan, not always easy to implement, but a roadmap, so to speak, to controlling respiratory diseases. And actually this same tool, tweaked slightly, will create a roadmap for solving any problem. And we call it the 5-step animal health model, our 5-step program. And they're very simple. Identify the desired goals and the customer expectations. And without that, if you don't know where you're going, you probably won't get there, right? And so it's really important up front to identify where they want to go. If they're going after, if the producer says, I really don't like to hear cough in my finishing barn, then that may take us down a different road than if he says everything to me is average daily gain or pigs out the door. And so it's really important to identify that goal and expectation up front. Then next thing you do is you got to find out what you're fighting. So you determine the current status of that farm or flow or system, and you do that. We've got several good tools for that. We maybe in cooperation with the diagnostic lab, we do serological profiling, find out what's there, which pathogens, and when those pigs are being exposed. And then you got to understand the current constraints. Maybe this is a continuous flow site, large finishing site with 30,000 head, not going to be depopulated, so you've got to work within those constraints with the current tools that you have. Once you understand those constraints, then develop those solution options, control what you can, and it may be a combination of therapeutic use of antimicrobials or vaccine or both. And so you've got a toolbox to go with, and you develop those solution options. And then you implement your plan, your solution option, and then monitor those results. And the most important thing then is the feedback. And if you have failures, don't quit, but start back over on the cycle again. Reassess and start back over. In conclusions, there's not one solution that fits all. That's a cookie cutter approach to respiratory diseases. Every farm that I've ever worked for, every system has its own constraints, its own goals, its own issues. And so using that 5-step approach, you can lead to increased awareness of the specific pathogens involved in the respiratory disease issues within that system or flow or barn, and allow for the proper intervention to be implemented. So 5-step process. I think there was a pamphlet that we use specifically for our PRRS control situation in pigs in your packet, and it just reiterates this 5-step program and gives a little more detail on how we use that tool. So.